So succession then, so the key to succession is part of the diagram really, and it's this idea that as plants grow in a place, they add dead organic matter to the soil, just like we saw in the carbon cycle. Over time, that dead organic matter builds up in the soil, and that makes the soil better. And how it makes the soil better is the soil's better able to hold on to water, so the plants don't suffer from lack of water. The soil is better able to hold on to soil nutrients like nitrogen in the form of nitrates or phosphates. Remember, phosphates are needed to make anything with a phosphate in, like the phospholipid bilayer of all cells, membranes. And the nitrates are needed to make amino acids, to make proteins, and they're needed to make nucleotides, and we covered that in the nitrogen cycle. And then gradually, as this soil gets better and better and better, it means that you get more and more plant growth and you get new species moving in. So a succession is one thing after another. It's literally what a succession means. So we could say the week is a succession of days, or we could say the year is a succession of days. Well, in this idea, the succession is you're getting one plant community after another after another. And remember, community is just a word that means all the species that live there. So another way of looking at this is a succession is just like the sequence of species that are able to grow in an area over time and how it changes. And the thing about succession is basically the plants are actually causing it by building soil. So once we looked at that idea, we sort of put it into a sort of bigger scale. And you can see the middle of the diagram here is the bit we've just talked about. So as the plants die or drop their leaves, the soil dead organic matter increases. There is a component of soil dead organic matter called humus, which is very slow to decompose. And humus acts like a sponge and holds water and stores nitrates and other essential soluble ions. And then the middle of the sort of central three, the abiotic conditions improve. Nitrogen fixation gradually builds up nitrogen ecosystem over hundreds and hundreds of years. Rock weathering by the plants breaks up the rock and starts to make a deeper soil, and this dead organic matter builds up over time. And then the third of those sort of central three, it's an easier place to live. A number of different plant species increases as they don't need to be so unusually specialist to survive here, and new species are able to survive. And then gradually the biomass of plants increases, and so does the complexity of the food web. So you'll start with a few plants, and then you'll have a few more plants, and then when you've got a few more plants, you'll get some herbivores. And once you've got enough herbivores, you'll start to get carnivores, and gradually it will become a more complex ecosystem. And that process goes on and on and on and on and on until eventually you reach a stage after a few thousands of years. It depends on the climate. In our climate, a few thousand years. In Iceland, probably slightly longer. In the tropics, much quicker. So the ecosystem eventually stops changing. Organic matter is being added at the same rate as it decomposes. The soil stops changing, no more species invade the area, and you end up with a dynamic equilibrium where individual trees live and die, but they're not going to be new species. If a tree falls over dead in the forest, the most likely thing to replace it is another tree from the same small list. If a bunny reaches bunny old age and passes on to bunny heaven, you're going to get more bunnies, but what you're not going to get is different species. So what we haven't covered is how does the whole thing start, and how the whole thing starts goes to the difference between primary and secondary succession. So we'll come back to that bit. Oh, actually, no, I suppose we could do. No, I'm in the wrong place. Just give us a little second. Oh dear, no, I'm going completely the wrong way. Just give us a second. Sorry. So if we just go back to this and look at this idea of these pioneer species. So in that initial disturbance that removes all the soil, we're talking like big landscape events. That environment is a really difficult place to grow because no water will stay in the soil if there is any soil, which there won't be. It'll just be gravel or bare rock, and the water will just flow through it. And there's no nitrates and no phosphates available because there hasn't been any microbial activity to fix nitrogen, and there isn't any dead organic matter. So those environments for the pioneer species are really harsh and difficult places to grow, and they're very highly adapted and specialized species. Now you could argue that they kind of make a mess of their own home, because by growing there, they make the home a better place for other plants to live, and eventually other plants do move in and out, compete them. So the pioneer species are sort of like living this peculiar life where they can inhabit really hostile abiotic environments, but just by growing there, they make it less hostile, and they end up getting out competed by new species as the new species move in. So we said eventually you reach this dynamic equilibrium, which is called the climatic climax community. It's climatic because it depends on the climate. If I got bare rock in Britain, eventually I get deciduous woodland. If I've got bare rock in Tanzania, eventually I get tropical grassland with elephants. It's the climax because it's the end of the process. You don't get any new species after this. You don't get more soil dead organic matter after this. You've reached a more or less constant environment. And it's a community because it's a collection of interacting species. Remember, that's the definition of community. It is the list of all species in an area. And we said, look, in the UK, you're going to get woodlands. In the mountains of Ecuador, you're going to get cloud forest. And in the lowlands of Tanzania, you're going to get open grasslands. And if you started with a lava field in each case, you'd get the same. You'd get different eventual outcomes because they depend on the climate. And then we said, look, the other thing that's useful to know about this is basically a summary of what happens over time. And I'm actually going to go through these because it's actually quite nicely summarized in one diagram at the end, which is this one here. That as time goes on, you get more soil organic matter, more soil nitrogen and more soil water holding capacity because of the dead organic matter. That means the abiotic conditions become less harsh. That means you get more plant biomass, weight of plants and numbers of species per unit area. That means you get more competition for light and soil resources amongst the plants. That means that habitat and species diversity reach a peak before the climatic climax community. So they say mid-succession is peak diversity, when the abiotic conditions aren't too harsh, but also there isn't too much competition. And then we just went through some examples, which you don't need to know any examples of, but they're very useful to illustrate some of the words. So if I just whip through this quickly, like so quickly you can't see it, and look at this summary table. We said in the case of a sand dune, the pioneer species are on the embryo of 4 dunes, and they are plants that are tolerant to lack of water, and they have all the features of the word's gone out of my head. Xerophytes, which is, remember, is in the plant transport part of the syllabus. And then as time goes on and you get a little bit more organic matter, then you get marram grass growing there in the yellow dunes. And then they become grey because you're adding dead organic matter and the sand starts to change colour because there's dead organic matter in it. And you get quite a lot of coexisting species. And really that's peak sort of biological diversity then. And then as it gradually turns into heath, I know we missed the dune slacks. The dune slacks is this idea that the bottom of the dunes is wet and the top of the dunes is drier. They're kind of the same age. When you reach the climatic climax community, the CCC in the final column, you end up with trees and woody plants, and they dominate the environment and decrease the diversity. So each stage in this process is called a seral stage. A sere is a particular succession. This is a Psammosere, a succession that starts with sand. And the stages, the seral stages here would be embryo dunes, yellow dunes, grey dunes, slacks and woodland, and the idea is one gradually turns into the other. And there's that diagram again. And then we gave another example about the Vikings colonising Iceland and destroying the soil, and then trying to work out how to put the soil back together again. So I'm just going to quickly work through this. You don't need to see this. You went through this with me. It's just a bit of historical background that you really don't need to know, but it just makes things easier to understand. Right, so there we go. So there's a load of lava eruptions on a map, colour-coded for Iceland. We know how old the lava eruptions are. If I go and look at what plants are there, I can work out the succession. And it's the same idea. Something big happens to get rid of the soil, in this case a volcanic eruption. And there it is. And then I get my pioneer species, and there they are, the mosses and lichens, which just by growing there gradually start to improve the abiotic conditions by building a soil. And then new species invade because the environment is a more friendly place to live. The abiotic conditions aren't as harsh. And here they are, crowberry and dwarf willow. And you can see it still basically looks like a load of rocks with not much plants on it, but there's more plants. And then the crowberries and the willows grow there year in, year out, adding more dead organic matter, starting to build up a bit of a soil. Their roots start to grow into the rocks and break the rocks up a bit. And then eventually bearberry and downy birch can survive. And now it actually does look like there's plants alive in it. I don't know if you can see, look, there's a dude here, look. Looks like he's blowing his nose over there. And it gives you some idea of the scale of this thing. So by this time we're starting to get some woody plants. They're starting to dominate light and soil nutrients, and it's starting to become quite a competitive place to live. But this is probably about peak diversity. And then eventually it will turn to a woodland, and once it's reached a woodland, it's sort of like it's at the end of the process. That's the climatic climax community. So in Iceland, the climatic climax community is downy birch forest. It's a woodland. It doesn't look like our woodlands. It's got different species of tree in it and different species of animals, but it's a woodland once again. All right, so once again, here it is then. This is the Lithosere succession that starts on bare rock. So each stage is called a seral stage. The whole thing is called a sere, meaning a particular succession. This one is a lithosere, a succession that starts on bare rock. And the seral stages here, they're often named after the plants, lichen and mosses, which is the pioneers, crowberries and dwarf willows, which is the next phase, then bearberries and downy birch, which is the next phase, and then eventually we reach the downy birch woodland, the last seral stage, which is the climatic climax community. And there's that diagram again, which is a really useful way of summarizing this information. If you can remember this diagram and explain what's happening and why it's happening, you basically understand this topic brilliantly. So then we said, okay, so what we've been looking at so far is what's called primary succession, and primary succession starts with no soil. But you'd also get a change in the vegetation if you start with soil. Now this is basically what happens when you dig your garden and then the weeds invade. And if you leave it to your own devices, you end up with woody weeds. And then after a few years, you've got a jungle of brambles and all sorts of awful, nasty. I'm just trying to remember what the name of the wretched stuff is now. It grows on, no, can't remember. It might pop into my head in a minute. So here, the difference between secondary and primary succession is in secondary succession, you've got rid of the plants, but you've kept the soil. And the pioneer species are just the ones that can find the space fastest. They don't have to be particularly good at growing in a bad place, because actually it's a brilliant place to grow. It's abiotically wonderful because it's got fantastic soil, and it's biotically wonderful because there's no competition. Eventually what will happen is the slow growing woody things will kind of take over. So it's like at the beginning in the primary succession, these pioneer species, in a primary succession, sorry, I got slightly confused. I'm going to start that again. The key differences between secondary succession and primary succession is in primary succession, the initial environment is abiotically harsh. It takes thousands of years to build the soil, and the pioneer species need to be able to tolerate harsh abiotic conditions. Whereas secondary succession is much, much faster because you've already got the soil, and really it's just a race to grow. And the pioneer species in the secondary succession are just quick growing weedy species that complete their life cycle. They go seed, growing plant, has some flowers, sets some seeds and dies, all in a year. And that's their basic technique, is find an empty space between the carrots and grow like mad before your parents pull them out. Right. Now there's a secondary succession in the United States of America, where if you burn a bit of land, within 5 to 150 years, it's got all sorts of trees over it. By 150 years, it's a mature forest. Now 150 years is quite a long time, but that's the growth time for oak and hickory. What we're comparing it to in primary succession, the primary succession, if I removed the soil in Kentucky and started with bare rock, we'd be talking thousands of years before you ended up with a forest, because soil is very slow to form. So then we said, okay, look, at the moment we've got this process and it leads to this dynamic equilibrium, to this climatic climax community. But actually, if you look around in Britain, not much of Britain is actually woodland. So if the British climatic climax community is woodland, how come it isn't all woodland? And the answer is, of course, because we change it. So what we do is we deflect, we send in a different way. We deflect the succession to a plagioclimax. And a plagioclimax is a false climax, meaning that if I withdraw the management, it's the zombie movie, the plants take over and Chicago ends up covered in trees. So examples in Britain of plagioclimaxes, so the plagioclimax community, which is achieved by a management technique, we've deflected the succession away from the climax community to a plagioclimax. You need to know 3. Pasture, which is grass. Grass are able to withstand grazing. When you mow the grass, it doesn't kill it. If you chop the apical buds off, another bit of biology, isn't it? Apical buds, that's in the plant hormones bit. If you chop the apical buds off most plants, it kills them, but plants can resist it. So if you graze an area, you don't even need actually to change the vegetation. If you put sheep on an area or cows on an area, if you leave it to their own devices, eventually it will all end up as grassland, because everything else is killed by being munched, but the grass isn't. So the management technique is grazing, and what you end up with is pasture, which basically is just a field with cows in. Heather generally grows in uplands just because it's got its abiotic preferences, but normally it gets outcompeted by trees. So the way we stop it being outcompeted by trees is we find a management technique that kills the trees but keeps the heather alive, and that turns out to be burning it. So about once every 20 years they burn the patch of heather, and that kills off any young trees, but it doesn't kill the heather because the heather's roots can survive the fire, and the heather regrows without any trees. And then last but by no means least, all those fields around Taunton that are full of potatoes and whatever they're full of, they clearly are not the climatic climax community. So how come they're not? Because they get ploughed every year. And the ploughing, of course, turns the soil upside down, and anything that's growing on the surface just gets buried. And of course, they also apply herbicides, chemicals that kill the weeds, or they pull them out by hand, or whatever mechanism you use. There's a management technique to maintain it as an arable cropland. And again, if we think back to the zombie movies, 5 years after the zombie disaster, the field is full of small shrubs. 20 years after the zombie disaster, the field is full of small trees. 100 years after the zombie disaster, you can't tell it was a field. I think that's the end. That is the end. Okay, enough.